Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity. I rise today and I first take note that today is May 1st, is the International Day of Solidarity among the workers of the world, and my colleagues on this side of the House take that day very seriously. But I say this to remind members that May Day has a second meaning. May Day is the international voice call of distress amongst mariners, and that is precisely what we are hearing today, Mr. Speaker, from First Nations across Canada with the introduction of Bill C-33. I put it to you, Mr. Speaker, and I maintain that Bill C-33 is pure Orwellian newspeak at work. In George Orwell's 1984, it was the Minister of Peace that waged war. It was the Ministry of Love that oversaw torture. It was the Minister of Plenty that oversaw rationing. And here, Mr. Speaker, we have the Conservative government introducing in Parliament a bill euphemistically called an Act for First Nation Control of First Nations Education, which should more appropriately be called a bill to increase ministerial power over First Nations education and to limit First Nation inherent rights. Today, Mr. Speaker, as we speak, the minister does not have the long list of power which this bill is designed to give him by statute. Currently, the minister has to rely on a not-so-genteel form of extortion, in which First Nations must agree to sign a contribution agreement which stipulates those powers to the minister in order that they can get money to educate their children. Well, Bill C-33 would give the minister, who is, Mr. Speaker, I remind you, a person of another culture, another background, another language and history, all those intrusive powers by law. I have news for the minister, Mr. Speaker. The right of First Nations to control their education already exists. It is for this Parliament to recognize that right, an inherent right, a right confirmed by sacred treaties, a right recognized by international covenants. Bill C-33 would put limits on those rights by design, I argue, Mr. Speaker. First Nations are demanding nothing more than what we already take for granted. The right was not surrendered by First Nations at treaty, the right to see that your children receive an education in accord with your own culture, with your own language, with your own teaching of history and values. It's not necessary to have an Act of Parliament to confirm an existing right. All that is needed is a mechanism so that that right can be fulfilled and made manifest and realized by having the means provided to do it. In fact, letting Parliament give that right or afford that right makes it a legislated right and not an inherent right, which is one of the inherent flaws of this bill. So after the creative exercise in creative writing, which is the title of this bill, I ask you, Mr. Speaker, to consider the preamble. And we all know that the preamble does not have the effect of committing Canada to do anything, but I challenge members here today to read those lofty verses in the preamble and then try to match them in any meaningful way with the real content of the bill. And I'll give you an example. It says in the preamble, whereas First Nations must receive support that enables them to exercise their rights and fulfill their responsibilities relating to the education provided to their children. So all that sounds good, but compare that with the actual fact that we offer them a paltry 4.5% annual increase on the already miserly amount they receive now, which is half or less than what their provincial counterparts receive, and which would take up to 22 years to catch up without even considering population increases, inflation, increasing costs of education, and compare that with the lofty principles of the language in the preamble. What a cruel deception we are being asked to pass here, Mr. Speaker, with this legislation. Another example, the preamble says, whereas First Nations education systems must receive adequate, stable, predictable, and sustainable funding, and then we give them a bill which makes this promise empty. An utterly cruel deception, Orwellian doublespeak, if I've ever seen it, inherent contradictions meant to deceive. Mr. Speaker, the minister is crowing that under the current system, there's no recognition of First Nations language and First Nations culture, and he is giving them that by virtue of this bill. This is another example of the Eurocentric, paternalistic, colonial attitude of this government. It is not his to give, Mr. Speaker, because that is already their unalienable inherent right. First Nations can already teach language and culture if they choose to do so. The permission of the minister is not required, but under Bill C-33, the minister can impose the regulations that will set out how that language and culture will be taught. He can impose the amount of money which can be spent for that purpose. He can impose who is qualified to teach the language and culture and whether the laws of the province apply to the teaching of that language and culture. The end result is that First Nations will have less control over the teaching of language and culture than it has now. It is blatantly disingenuous or ignorant to imply otherwise. I ask you, Mr. Speaker, to look at Section 43 for another example of contradictory Orwellian newspeak. Section 43 provides that the minister must pay to a First Nation education authority an amount of money determined by a calculation which is what it costs for a provincial public school in a similar location per pupil to provide educational services. And on first reading, you would assume then that by this legislation they will get the same amounts of money as provincial students do. Except to read further on the very next page, Section 45 of the bill states that the minister will obtain an order of council limiting the amount of money in any fiscal year to whatever amount the minister wants to set, or whatever amount of money the minister can pry out of the hands of his Minister of Finance around the cabinet table. So presto, the obligation to provide equitable education has just vanished, completely vanished, because the reality is Section 45 trumps, again, the lofty principle, the carrot dangled by Section 43. And I know the members opposite will say that, of course, we have to be fiscally responsible. We can't do this all at once. We have to phase it in gradually. In actual fact, there are two problems with that argument. The first is that if a First Nation school decides they can no longer deprive their children of the education they deserve and decide to send their children to a nearby provincial school, the minister will pay that full school tuition for that student, double the amount that he plans to spend if that child stayed on the reserve. The money will be there for that. So why isn't it available as a first option for that student to stay at the reserve school? And the second reason is a larger picture, perhaps, that we really have to address in the context of this kind of funding question, and that is that First Nations receive absolutely not one penny from the tens of billions of dollars from oil, minerals, forestry products, natural resources taken from their lands. Trillions of dollars over the years if you add it up. You can't tell people that there is no money to provide for the basic needs of First Nations children to realize their full potential when we're harvesting tens of billions of dollars per year from First Nations lands and First Nations territories. In all good conscience, Mr. Speaker, those of us in this House of Commons have to address that fundamental issue. First Nations children are Canadian children, and all Canadian children deserve the right to realize their full potential through a quality education. I want to take a moment, Mr. Speaker, to look at the international obligations that this bill fails to acknowledge or recognize. 2014 marks the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child, and Article 28 recognizes the right of the child to equal opportunity to education. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People states that Indigenous people must have access to schools consistent with language, culture, and values, and Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own language and cultures. And Article 13 of that UN Declaration states that Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, language, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. Bill C-33 gives no recognition to any of these international instruments, nor does it acknowledge that Canada has any responsibilities and obligations in these regards, and I believe, Mr. Speaker, that this is by design, not by any oversight. We've also heard the minister say that Bill C-33 is a first step, a transition to something better, and this will evolve into something more acceptable in time. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is exactly what they said about the Act for the Gradual Civilization of the Indians 14 decades ago. And we still have the Indian Act today, an act best described as 140 years of social tragedy, Mr. Speaker, an act unworthy of a Western developed democracy. And again, this bill, instead of rising above that act, is consistent with the Indian Act in that regard. What is the purpose of this act? Well, the bill states in Section 3 that the purpose of this act is to provide for the control by First Nations of their education systems by enabling councils of First Nations to administer schools situated on the reserves. And that, perhaps more than any one phrase, is the nutshell of the problem. There is considerable difference between control by First Nations of education and enabling councils to administer the schools. The whole structure of Bill C-33 is to give control over First Nation education to the minister and then to provide for the administration of the minister's will at the local level by the council. Now, the boss gets to dictate the means of production and the workers get to decide what color to paint the lunchroom. That's about what this boils down to, but that it would not be a vision of industrial democracy. In this bill, First Nations are finally going to be allowed to be their own Indian agents. Again, that's what this boils down to. The administrators of regulations decided in Ottawa by the minister on their behalf. The charade continues, Mr. Speaker, with Section 7. The Council of a First Nation must, in accordance with this Act, provide access to education to any person who is ordinarily resident on a reserve, and thus Bill C-33 imposes obligation on a First Nation council to provide education whether or not the resources are provided to do so. Neither is there freedom of the council in how it complies. It must do so, again, in accordance with this Act. It expands the discretionary powers of the minister in more than one ways, Mr. Speaker, and if we can't see what's wrong with that mindset and worldview, we have no right to be addressing such an important subject today. In Section 10, we come to the Joint Council of Education Professionals. Now, why do they call it a joint council when all the appointments are made by Cabinet, the chair is made by Cabinet, and the minister can kick out anyone who doesn't toe the line? That is what a powerless group it is. Essentially, it sits and waits until the minister asks them for their advice on certain matters, but the minister is under no obligation to follow this advice or to explain why the advice isn't followed. This is not self-determination, Mr. Speaker, under any sense of the word, nor does it meet the test of true implementation of authority over the system. He is only obliged to ask them their advice when he wishes to do so. And we'll never know what that advice to the minister was or why it was being implemented or not, because advice from a statutory body to a minister is considered confidential Cabinet confidence and protected from release. There's no obligation of the Council to support First Nations control of education. The minister says the Council provides oversight to the operation of the Act, but unfortunately Bill C-33 provides no oversight powers. Again, an inherent flaw with this legislation that I believe is deliberate and not by accident. And now, when concerns like this are raised, the minister's response is, trust me. There will be political protocols, he has assured his doubters. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't have to remind you that Ottawa is a boneyard of discarded political protocols. And why does the minister want to wait until after the bill becomes law to offer a protocol? I think we all know, Mr. Speaker, what the answer to that question is. So in Section 20 of Bill C-33, we move into the governance. And again, we find what I believe is tricky and calculated deception. You have to read Section 20 with one eye focusing on what the bill says the First Nations can do, and the other eye focusing on the power of the minister to make the regulations. For example, the Council must establish policies and procedures, establish education programs, attendance policies, success plans, monitor the quality of education, and provide the minister with an annual report. And the minister says this is evidence of local control. But the bill goes on to provide the minister with the unilateral authority to impose regulations which set out the form and content of the budgets, the plans, the programs, the policies, and the minister may also impose provincial law to govern such matters. Again, Mr. Speaker, this bill has to be read in its totality, not isolated clauses selected in order to make a certain case that local autonomy or local control is in fact a reality. Section 21 also provides that First Nation language can be the language of in instruction, but it has to be in addition to English or French. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, that clause pretty well wipes out the possibility of immersion in instruction. I mean, can you imagine telling a French immersion school that it must also be providing parallel instruction in English? And will there be any extra funding for instruction in a First Nation language? Again, Bill C-33 is silent in this regard. And then once again, the instruction of the Indigenous language must be provided in accordance to the regulations unilaterally set out by the minister. Trust me, the minister says. Mr. Speaker, I'm almost out of time, as you've noted with me, and I'm not even halfway through this bill. It gives a cause for us to reflect just how pockmarked and potholed with one-way streets, with arrows pointing both ways, this bill really is. I've not had time to mention how the provinces are going to react when the minister starts to force the provinces to pick up part of the tab bit by bit, until I argue the whole expense is going to be offloaded. I've been assisted by comments and analysis which are starting to emerge from First Nations, and I urge members opposite to do the same. But I will end my formal remarks there by pointing out how appalling I find it that a bill of this nature has been subjected to time allocation and closure before the opinions of those First Nations can be registered and made manifest before decision makers and policy makers. I can't imagine anything more contradictory to First Nation culture than to shut down debate in a culture that values oral tradition, that values letting everyone's voice be heard until consensus is achieved. What they've done here today, and I honestly didn't think they would have the gall to invoke closure on a bill of this nature, of this subject matter, but they have. They keep saying, well, the AFN is in favor of this bill, and so therefore that's why we're plowing ahead. We've heard from First Nations. As of 2 hours ago, the Executive Council of the Assembly of First Nations has overridden the opinion of their leader. A resolution to that effect is coming forward on May the 14th. There's a confederacy scheduled for Ottawa where these First Nations leaders are going to bring the true position of the affiliates of the Assembly of First Nation to convey their real opinion of this bill, which is unanimously opposed. No one can find a First Nations constituency in the country that supports this bill. And to implement it now would be the height of hypocrisy and Eurocentric arrogance, colonial Eurocentric arrogance. And I say this looking at the Parliamentary Secretary to Aboriginal Affairs, who I think knows better and knows how offensive to the sensibilities of First Nations and all Canadians it would be to continue this legacy of paternalistic colonialism and impose on them a piece of legislation that they are not in favor of. Whether they say their consultation met the test of true consultation or not, I don't believe it did, but whether they maintain that or not, the tables have turned. As of today, as of 2 hours ago, this has all changed. But yet by May the 14th, will we even still be debating this bill? Or will it have been rammed through the House of Commons and sent on to the Conservative-dominated Senate? This bill warrants and deserves careful examination. First Nations have a right to have input in the legislative process, to give testimony at committee. If there was ever a bill that should be taken on the road by committee for consultation in each region of the country, this is one of them. How, in God's name, I know it's not my job to ask them questions, they'll ask me, how do they justify clamping down the debate on such an important piece of legislation and denying the opportunity for First Nations to participate in the legislative process. It's beyond me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's always good to hear from one of Parliament's great storytellers, and unfortunately, a lot of his analysis of the bill was fiction when it comes to his conspiracy theories about the sinister plot of the minister to wrest control away from First Nations by giving them more control, by denying them funding, by giving them more funding. He described as miserly the $1.55 billion per year that that the government provides for funding, and provides as miserly the $1.9 billion increase that was proposed in the last budget, which of course he voted against. Mr. Speaker, perhaps it's because of that the member from Western Arctic, who hasn't been given an opportunity by his party to participate, he mentioned in his question yesterday that he thought every school in Canada on reserve, there's 600 reserves, he thought, well, if every reserve got a new school, in his estimation it was $50 million to $100 million per school that we would need. So just $60 billion would do the job for the NDP to meet the obligation. Perhaps the member can give us an update if the member from Western Arctic, who until very recently was the deputy critic for Aboriginal Affairs, does his $60 billion, is that what the NDP is proposing, or is that miserly as well?
Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you don't need legislation to elevate the standards of contribution for First Nations students to the provincial equivalent. The province of Manitoba is a good example. There's reserves near Thompson, Manitoba, where the average, the funding per capita per student is $7,000 or $8,000 by the federal government. The province's funding per student in Thompson, Manitoba, right nearby, is $15,000. One could argue that the amount of money per capita in reserve schools could in fact be even higher than the provincial average because of the special needs and the historical catching up that may need to be done in order for First Nation students to achieve their full potential through education. Now, you don't need legislation to do that. It could have found its way into the 2014 budget, but even by implementation of this bill, we won't see any improvement until 2016, conveniently just after the next federal election. I suppose they'll be dangling that as some kind of a carrot in front of the nose of Aboriginal voters. But, you know, this is the hypocrisy of it. And then what they contemplate is this paltry increase, 4.5% of the current 2% cap. 22 years by our calculation before there's a catch-up to our First Nations schools are funded to the same degree as their provincial counterpart. That's without taking into account increase in population and the increase in the cost of providing education. There's no built-in formula, escalating formula in that model. He knows it's paltry. He knows it's cheap. I don't know what wild numbers he's pulling out of his hat now, but the total amount of money that goes to First Nations people is paltry on a per capita basis. You might say it's not all about money. A lot of it's about money.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Cowichan.
I want to thank the member from Winnipeg Centre for that eloquent speech. And as he started out the speech, he rightly centred the concerns and the approach in a rights-based approach. And unless we take education and other matters with regards to First Nations from a rights-based approach, we are always going to get it wrong. And this piece of legislation that's before the House, really, the bill should be called the First Nations Administration of First Nations Education, not the First Nations Control of First Nations Education. Because what this bill does is provide administrative functions for bands. It provides administrative detail. It provides administrative reporting. And, of course, the other piece of this is that the government consistently says that First Nations are consulted. And the member from Winnipeg Centre referred to one part of the bill that I think is a really important indicator of how this is not consultation, and he referred to the regulations. And what we've heard Conservative members talk about is that First Nations will have control over how those regulations are going to be developed. And of course, all of those regulations are where all of the details are in terms of how this Act is going to move forward. What it says is the Joint Council. The Joint Council. That is not First Nations. That Joint Council has got, the Minister has the overall authority in terms of appointment on that Joint Council. And that Joint Council is made up of 9 people. So I wonder if the member from Winnipeg Centre could comment on the fact that how the Joint Council simply does not constitute appropriate First Nations engagement and involvement in the development of regulations.
Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Nanaimo Cowichan, and thank her for her advocacy on behalf of First Nations people during her long tenure as the official opposition's senior critic for Aboriginal affairs. And she's right. The Joint Council process, this by no way is giving First Nations control over their education. It's giving them an obligation to administer carefully the directives dictated by the minister. The unilateral discretionary authority of the minister has been enhanced and augmented. It's hard to believe that you could expand on the overwhelming powers that the Minister of Indian Affairs, Aboriginal Affairs has over First Nations people. But this bill, in fact, does. It contemplates an increase in support to First Nations students, but at the direction and control of the Minister of Indian Affairs, not First Nations people. And again, subject to what he's able to wrest from the Minister of Finance in any given year. Their model is not equal funding, as it would be with provincial students, and then work backwards. Their model is we will seek to achieve equal funding if the Minister of Indian Affairs has enough clout around the cabinet table to divide the pie to provide better resources to First Nations people. That's far, far cry from the rights-based approach that my colleague from the Nanaimo Cowichan says should be guiding and informing the development of this important public policy.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Prince Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important we set the record straight because what my colleague had in his performance before was not necessarily reflecting of what we're hearing from the AFN. You know, first of all, there's the 5 conditions that were set out by the AFN. That's in this piece of legislation. The legislation, if passed, would not define nor alter Aboriginal or treaty rights that exist. So his comments on that, of course, is incorrect. Clause 4 of the bill specifically notes that it does not abrogate or derogate from the protection provided for Aboriginals or treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada by Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982. In fact, AFN National Chief said this will serve as a bridge to self-government. You know, what disappoints me, Mr. Speaker, is we're talking about $1.9 billion that will go to educating kids on reserves, to give them the education, the skill sets that they require to achieve in this economy, this great economy that's going on here in Canada. And the NDP won't even let it go to committee. They're going to defeat it on second reading if they had their choice. Now, and of course, their solution is let's spend some $60 billion in trying to solve this. Totally hypocrisy in what they think is what's reasonable and what's required. It just shows you the NDP has no clue what First Nations people really need and want. So my question to the member is, will he allow this passage of this bill to go to second reading and actually go to committee and move forward? And we at least give these kids a chance to participate in this strong, booming economy and get the skill sets that they need so they can achieve and succeed.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the party that member represents has not only denied the ability of First Nations to come forward and have their voices heard in the process of establishing this legislation, they've undermined the democratic institution that we're sitting in as we speak by repeatedly and again imposing closure. When you ask how many times how often does the Conservative Party invoke closure on bills? Every time, all of them. At every stage, Mr. Speaker, they shut down the ability for Canadians, the voices of Canadians to be heard. The people on this side of the House represent the majority of Canadians, including many, many First Nations, whose voices deserve to be heard. They have no concept of consultation and accommodating the legitimate concerns of all Canadians. One thing they never learned is that when they manage to achieve their majority government, they have to be government to all the people, not just those who voted for them. And there's a great section of the population that did not vote for them, but who still have legitimate points of view, that they have an obligation to accommodate those legitimate points of view instead of shutting down debate like a bunch of goose-steppers, Mr. Speaker. It's appalling. So for him to characterize the speech that I just gave as a performance just shows how truly ignorant he is, perhaps, of the issues facing First Nations people and those who struggle on a daily basis to provide the best education possible for their people with an impossible funding mechanism that we have now. We would support a bill that truly did lead towards equality of educational opportunities for First Nations people. This bill doesn't do it, and they will find very soon there's not a First Nation in the country that agrees with them. They will be trying to impose this in their Eurocentric, colonial, paternalistic attitude that's an extension of the Indian Act.